Frank, well, there is a lot of questions to get through. So thank you all for joining us today. My name is Alyssa Taylor. I'm a program coordinator with the Monarch Joint Venture. I'm joined by my coworker, Jenna Tots, who's an education coordinator. She'll be either letting you in from the waiting room or trying to help you with any tech issues that you might have. She's on the back end of our call today. But thank you all for joining us for our second Ask an Expert session. I'm super happy to be here with Chris Helzer and Garth Fuller from the Nature Conservancy, helping to share their perspectives today. So this is our second session. It's a really fun opportunity to go through questions that you all have provided us and to give you an opportunity to learn more about North American grasslands. So really critical habitat for monarchs and just overall biodiversity across North America. So really fun, really excited, and thank you all for taking the time to join us. Jen and I work for the Monarch Joint Venture. Our mission is to protect monarchs and their migration by collaborating with partners to deliver habitat conservation, education, and science across their monarch range. I do want to just thank Chris and Garth again, our experts for today, for sharing their time and knowledge and supporting this webinar opportunity. So we really appreciate their dedication to conservation and research of these really critical landscapes. And thank you all also for joining us and taking the time to write some thoughtful questions that'll really be the basis of this conversation today. So I do want to let you know there were a lot of questions that were submitted. We might not get to all of them, but we're going to do our best to cover a lot of ground today during this session. So don't be sad if we can't get to it, but we will have an opportunity for you to ask questions during the webinar using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you can't see that, you'll just click the little circle with the 3 dots. You'll see the Q&A, and you'll be able to ask questions from there. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. A couple other opportunities if you're looking for more webinar or more virtual opportunities. We do have a monarch conservation webinar coming up, our last one of the year, on December 16th. It's going to be the climate change effects on the timing of monarch life history with Dylan MacArthur Waltz. It should be a really interesting talk. And then after that, you can look forward to our 2026 webinar announcements coming soon. Other virtual opportunities, if you haven't been to it, we have our Monarch Nectar Hub. There are a plethora of resources on there, from learning about monarch community science opportunities, getting your kids involved in monarch conservation, if you're looking for some backyard gardening techniques. So lots of cool resources on there if you're just looking for some virtual opportunities or maybe some gift giving opportunities in the upcoming season. You will have a great opportunity to purchase some of those courses because we'll be giving you a discount for joining us today. So Jenna will be sharing that in our follow-up email with you all as well. I do want to just again thank the Nature Conservancy and Chris and Garth for joining us. If you're feeling so inclined, Chris actually works in Nebraska, Garth in Oregon. So Jenna's going to be dropping some links in the chat for you all if you are feeling so inclined to support their work, as well as the work of the Monarch Joint Venture as well. Last but not least, I do want to give you those couple of quick tips and techniques for Zoom before we really take too much of your time and get into these questions. This webinar is going to be recorded, so if you have to hop off or you pop in and out, don't worry, we'll send a follow-up email. We'll have this in there. We'll probably provide some cool links and resources for you as well. So just keep that in mind that we'll be following up with that. As far as asking questions, use the Q&A box, not the chat. It's easier for us to keep track. At the latter end of this session today, so probably like the last 20 minutes or so, we will give you all the opportunity to unmute and ask questions to Garth or Chris. If you are interested in doing that, I do want you to denote that in your question when you're putting it in the Q&A box and write live at the beginning and then ask your question so that we know to call on you to allow you to unmute to talk to them directly. If you don't want to do that, you just want to ask a question, you can throw that into the Q&A and we'll be moderating those to our speakers as well. So you have two kind of opportunities to do that. You can leave your camera on or off, but we do ask that you stay muted for now so that everybody can hear. You can also change your view at the top of your screen using the view button, where you can just select to view speaker mode so you're not seeing every box on the screen as well. So you have a few options. Finally, if you're looking for captions, you do have that as well. If you need translated captions, those are also available. So you can use those at the bottom of your screen also. And with that, I'm going to scoot along and I'm going to introduce our two experts for today. First, we have Chris Helzer. He's the Nebraska Director of Science and Stewardship for the Nature Conservancy. He joined the Nature Conservancy in 1997 as a land steward and has gradually moved more into science and outreach roles. Currently, he conducts research and supervises the Conservancy's Preserve Stewardship program. He also helps to develop and test prairie management and restoration strategies. In addition, Chris uses his writing and photography to promote prairies and their conservation to a broad audience. And if you happen to see any of our social media posts, those photos were courtesy of Chris. So fantastic photographs if you haven't seen any of his work. And then we also have Garth, who is joining us from the West Coast. So thank you, Garth. Garth Fuller is in Eastern Oregon. He is the Eastern Oregon Conservation Director for the Nature Conservancy. Garth began working for the Nature Conservancy in 1994 in Minnesota, where his land steward job included prairie and savanna habitat restoration and prescribed fire. Moving to Oregon in 2004, his work has focused on habitat conservation through management on TNC lands, public land, partnerships, and policy in grasslands and sagebrush steppe from that form Oregon's rangelands. So once again, I do just want to thank you all for taking your time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because we just don't need it anymore. And I'm going to just kick off our first question. I'm going to kind of softball it to Chris and Garth here. And just ask you guys to talk a little bit about where you work and how you work in your different roles in grasslands and where you work.
Go ahead, Garth. You want to go first?
I was hoping you would break the ice, but I guess I'll take one for the team. Well, I'll start by adding my thanks to everybody, even though you're just a sea of names on my screen. I know that you're all really human beings that have a active interest in grasslands and conservation. So thanks for that. It's great to be in a group of kindred spirits. Look forward to having some good conversation. Well, so like in the intro, I am based in Oregon and I focus on the grasslands and sagebrush steppe habitats in the Pacific Northwest. I have worked in the past in the Great Plains and in the tall grass prairies, so that's sort of where I cut my teeth on prairie. I went to the University of Illinois for my undergraduate and chased prairie voles and learned to ID prairie plants as what feels like a kid now when I think back to those days. And then I went and did a master's degree in conservation biology and sustainable development and eventually worked my way back into prairies and savannas in the Midwest in Minnesota. But then coming out here, I think the biggest change for me, besides looking at the different species and the different ecosystem types in the grasslands and sagebrush steppe, was scale. Like moving from working on prairie remnants, which I still love to go back to see some of the places I worked in Illinois and Minnesota, they were like tens of acres, and if we were lucky, maybe 1,000 acres. And there was one site that was 3,000. And then I came out to Oregon, and now I'm working on sites that are hundreds of thousands of acres in size. And so what I do and what we do with the Nature Conservancy and partners has also changed a bunch. So that'll be part of our conversation today, like working at a project level versus at a landscape scale. I work a lot on sagebrush steppe, like the photo that's in my background, which is essentially a grassland with shrubs in it. And typically it's sagebrush, but there's a whole plethora of shrub species, shrub and brush, that are in the sage steppe system. And so it's basically a prairie with small trees. And so a lot of what we talk about will translate to sagebrush steppe as well as sort of the treeless prairies. And I'll just one more thing before I toss it to you, Chris. I would say that I spent a lot of time working with private landowners who have who own and manage property in a ranching context, and that means that they typically have grazing permits on public lands for the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service. So the intersection of my work these days is to cross that boundary from things that where people have a lot of control on their private lands and what they do, moving into an area where they might have a lot of influence but not control, and trying to work with the federal land and state land managers to have a coordinated approach for conservation of the grasslands. So that's enough about me. Chris?
Yeah, great. So I'm in Nebraska. I work with tallgrass prairie, mixed grass prairie, and shortgrass prairie. Mostly I'm in the tallgrass and mixed grass. Um, and the only difference there really is that tallgrass prairie gets more rainfall, and so you have deeper soils, more productivity, taller plants. Most of the work I do, most of the land the Nature Conservancy has management staff for is right on that boundary of mixed grass and tall grass. So the two sites that I oversee, one is the Platte River Prairies, which is on the Central Platte River. It's a site most people know because of the sandhill crane migration. We get about 1 million sandhill cranes every spring that stage for a month or so in March. But it's a fragmented landscape, sort of like what Garth was describing in Minnesota, right? It's a lot of row crop land with prairies here and there. And so we've done a lot of prairie restoration there, trying to sort of fill in some of those gaps and defragment that landscape, but also do a lot of fire and grazing and other kinds of management. And then the other site that I work on for the Nature Conservancy is up in the Sandhills of Nebraska, which is the Niobrara Valley Preserve. The Sandhills is a 12 million acre landscape. It's the largest intact prairie landscape in North America. Um, it is almost all privately owned. Nebraska is 97% private land. So Garth was talking about public lands. That'll be a really interesting difference for us as we talk tonight, that in Nebraska, all the conservation that happens that means anything happens on private lands. And so we're trying to figure out how to manage land in the best way we can, but we're always also thinking about translation and how to find things that would work for ranchers and farmers who own the land that matters in terms of conservation. We're never going to own enough land to really change the world, and so that's the way we have to work. Having said that, the Niobrara Valley Preserve is 56,000 acres in size, so it is big. We've got 1,400 bison that graze about half of that site, and the other half is grazed by cattle, and that'll be a fun discussion later, I think, about talking about both cattle and bison grazing. We do both; they can both be used for lots of things. Um, and I guess Garth, you talked about your background. I mean, really quick, I had a wildlife biology major for undergraduate, and then in my master's degree, I studied landscape ecology. So kind of large scale ecology. I studied grassland birds and habitat fragmentation. So that's my academic background for what it's worth.
Worth everything. We gotta know. We gotta know. Well, thank you both for joining us and kind of being so willing to share your space. I think grasslands are such an important topic to raise awareness on and get an understanding of, not only for monarch conservation, but for vast biodiversity conservation, obviously conservation of the ecosystems themselves. So I'm gonna dive right into questions. And we'll start with like one of the management questions that comes along with grasslands, and that's fire. So can you discuss a little bit about um, prescribed fire and methods for timing for controlling kind of invasive grasslands and or invasive grasses and tree control?
Sure. Garth, I made you go first. Do you want me to go first this time? Okay. Um, Couple things to start off with. One, fire, I think, is often seen as a natural event, and it can be, but at least here in my part of the world, fire has always been associated with humans also. And most of the fires that sort of drove grassland ecology at least for the last 10,000 years since the glaciers left Nebraska, the majority of those fires have been lit intentionally by people. So indigenous fire sort of pushed the spruce trees back, kept the oak trees from taking over everything, and turned a lot of this landscape into grassland. And so when I think about fire, wildfires are out there and they do mean something, but most of the fires that have been relevant in this part of the world have been human set fires, which means it's all been driven by objectives, and that's what we do today too, right? So any fire that we light, we're thinking about why are we using fire, in what context, what are we trying to accomplish? We don't use fire just because fire is good. And so we have very specific objectives. And some of those have to do with timing for sure. You know, we have invasive grasses here like smooth brome or Kentucky bluegrass or tall fescue, that a lot of them grow in the early part of the season. And so if we burn in, for example, late April or early May, we can use a fire to suppress the competition ability or the dominance of those grasses and give some other species a chance to thrive. But we don't do that every year because we don't want anybody to win or lose every year, or different, have different plants at certain times of year that always win or lose. And a lot of the fire that we do here is tied to our grazing work, which we can talk more about with when we get into grazing maybe later. But if you think historically about fires in the Great Plains, indigenous fire was a lot of times used to drive bison patterns and the grazing patterns of other animals that they were hunting. And so they would set a fire knowing that that's where the hunting ground was going to be. And then that would get grazed down really hard, which means it wouldn't burn the next year. And then they'd go somewhere else and burn. So there was always this really cool mosaic of fire and grazing pressure that sort of shifted around the landscape. And a lot of the animals and plants and other parts of the community were really well adapted to that. But last point I'll make here is that history is interesting and there is a lot of value in understanding the history, but we're in a place now where we're managing looking forward, not backward most of the time. The world is so different now than it was 15 or 20 years ago, let alone 100 or 300 years ago, or whatever context you want to look at. And so we don't just look back and say, well, what was the historical fire frequency here? Let's just do that. That doesn't happen. That doesn't work. It doesn't accomplish what we need to accomplish. So we have to be really thoughtful about how we use fire.
Yeah, great kickoff, Chris. I really liked the way you phrased or I would say put a twist on the fire story by it being objective driven for millennia, which is really an interesting insight. And I guess that had been part of my thinking, but the way you phrased it really just kind of put that into place in my brain. So I appreciate that. And that is very true out west as well. I'd say one of the biggest differences around fire and using it as a management tool in the western states, depending on where you are in the West, this is a slightly different story, but we have annual invasive grasses like cheatgrass now and Medusa head, ventonata, and some others that really dominate with fire. And there's a positive feedback, positive for the cheatgrass, negative for the native biota. But that cheatgrass really thrives on frequent fire. So we do use fire for objectives like knocking back cool season grasses or brush, to control encroaching trees. But now we have this other twist in it that we've got to pay attention to the other non-natives that are showing up that really proliferate with that frequent fire. And we can use fire, if we change the season and time it right, we can actually use it as a tool, but it has become more complicated. So it is absolutely driven by objectives, like just saying we need more fire in the system because it's a process that's missing will inadvertently make things worse. And so, we're in the West, we're facing some of those same hurdles. I just thought I'd make a point too that coming to Oregon, it was interesting. The people, we call different kinds of grassland prairie here too. There's I know most prairie is bunchgrass prairie, but there is a particular bunchgrass prairie type in the West that's part of the Palouse prairie system, and that's up in the northeast corner of the state. So some of the people participating this evening might know of the Zumwalt Prairie, and it's certainly, you could Google it. There's some cool stuff out there about it. And it's the largest remnant of Palouse bunchgrass prairie left in the US. There's a couple 100,000 acres, and the Nature Conservancy manages, around, I think I mentioned earlier, about 50,000 acres or so. And we use fire there, but it's really careful now because of that, the change in that, what happens when we put fire in. Anyway, I could talk more about fire, but maybe it'll come up again.
Well, Garth, are you using fire and grazing together like we are? Is that a combination that happens a lot? Or do you see them as more separate processes most of the time?
They're more separate than what you do. The patch fire grazing mosaic was not part of the evolution of these prairies out here. We had intermittent herds of grazing animals, like up in that Palouse prairie. There were occasional times where bison were there, but often they weren't, over the millennia. So it was more browsing. And so we see the same pattern though. Like if we have a graze system and we burn, the grazing animals go there, whether it's the livestock or the elk or the mule deer, it's like candy, they go right there. So the same thing is happening. We just haven't built it into our rotation the same way that you have.
Cool. Yeah, and just to clarify that, if people aren't familiar with it, what fire does there is it does two things. It removes all the thatch, all the dead stuff, all the dead vegetation from previous years that are sort of in the way for the grazing animal to get a bite of what they really want, which is the green stuff. So it makes it easier to get what they want, and they get a more efficient bite of food. But also the quality of that food right after a fire, that green, really lush growth is high in protein. It's very digestible. It's got everything that those animals need. And so a lot of our management, well, one way we can manage here is just to have a huge fence around, a large area, have grazing animals out there, and then just burn a different piece of that each year. And that shifts the grazing pressure, and you have some areas that get grazed and some areas that get rested. It's a really easy and efficient way to manage. Um, but we always have to layer other things on top of that as well.
What I'm hearing is it's complicated and it's complex and it's different. That's what I'm hearing from you. Um, Garth, I did want to just touch on really quickly in relationship to fire. Could you explain that distinction about grasslands being a fire break or not, and if they're good or bad in relationship to wildfires?
Sure. And I think that was the question, right? Our grasslands, can they serve as a fire break? And Chris and I caught up real briefly about this, and I think it is an interesting difference. So in the Great Plains, you would say absolutely not. Like grass is the flammable fuel, and so you can use mowed grass and grazed grass as a fire break, but you would need to do other actions like wet lining, or maybe you would even use a road or something instead. But in the sagebrush steppe system, or even in some of the larger grasslands at the landscape scale, we do use pure grass areas, as you would call them, maybe less a fire break, but as a fire management tool. So they sometimes get called green strips in the sagebrush steppe region, where the fire intensity, fire length, duration, and the amount of heat that comes off of the fuel is greatly reduced in grass. So if you compare to sagebrush or bitterbrush or any of the chaparral fuel types. So if you are managing a fire, you would like to manage the edge of your controlled burn or your wildfire with a green strip, a grass fire break. So I'm not sure if that's what the question was driving at, but yes, you can do that. And one of the things we're working with ranchers in the Bureau of Land Management to think about is landscape scale use of grass strips like that to help control some of these very large wildfires that historically used to burn, every maybe 5 to 30 years in these habitat types in patches. So they might have been, a large fire might have been 10,000 acres, but now with the invasion of cheatgrass and other annual grass, we're seeing fires at 100,000 acres in size. And the fuel that's that the annual grass represents is now like a carpet underneath all of the shrubs and in between the bunch grasses. And so you get a very uniform fire that burns hot, has a longer residence time next to the brush, and it top kills a lot of things that have a hard time coming back. And so we see a conversion at a landscape scale where we're losing sagebrush, which has a hard time recovering after fire. So if a normal fire cycle might have taken 30 years, that's enough time for seeds to come back in, or the little refugia, the patches that didn't burn to spread. And now that isn't happening. So yeah, it's a bit of a tangent, but those fire breaks, those grass strips are an important part of fire management at a landscape scale.
I think that's another interesting difference because in the Great Plains and the Midwest, fire is often used as a way to control encroachment of trees and shrubs. But there's been some changes there too. It works really effectively for things like eastern red cedars, which is a juniper species that doesn't resprout. And so if you burn it and you burn the whole tree, it'll die back and then it's done. It doesn't come back anymore. But anything that's deciduous, which is most of our other species, um, deciduous trees, deciduous shrubs, things like wild plum or sumac or dogwood, those resprout. And we think historically you could burn, every 3 to 5 years and do a pretty good job of keeping those out or minimizing their footprint at least. What we're seeing now is that that's changed dramatically, driven a lot by carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, actually, which makes those woody plants much more competitive. And so now we're seeing that even if we burn every couple of years, it's not always enough to keep them from moving into a new area. And then once they're there, even burning annually in places doesn't get rid of them anymore. And so fire is still an important piece of our management of woody plants, but we're having to really scramble now and understand what this new system looks like that we're working in to figure out other ways to balance that grassland, shrubland, woodland mix. And it's sort of exciting in a way. I mean, if you think of it just as a research question, there's a lot that's really interesting about it. But we have a little bit of time in the northern Great Plains or the Midwest where I'm at, um, because we still have a lot of grasslands that haven't been encroached on by those trees, as opposed to like the southern plains where a lot of the grasslands are just gone already. They're now shrublands or woodlands. But we have to figure out what we want the landscape to look like at the same time that we're trying to figure out the management techniques that work. So it's sort of a fun, interesting, challenging, scary challenge that we're working with right now.
Yeah, well, I'd jump in and say that there's some similar things going on. So some of our participants tonight are live on the West Coast. We have pinyon, pine, juniper encroachment, really similar to what you're describing. And it's, yeah, the fire isn't enough to keep it back, or we're having these other negative fire issues and historic fire suppression. So yeah, now it's a puzzle. You're masticating and mowing and doing a bunch of other stuff. So.
I think you brought up, Chris, you kind of led into a few of the questions that have popped up, and I'm kind of going to meld them into one as it relates to climate. But how do you balance the historical consistency of a landscape versus kind of future proofing and adapting to what is climate and what you can do for plant communities now when you're thinking about restoration and management practices?
Yeah, I mean, I think about that all the time. Um, what's what's hard, I think, for people is that it's a lot easier to look backwards because we can see what actually happened. And so that's the tendency, right? You like, well, you wish for the good old days, or you look backwards to get some guidance because then we can try to learn from what happened. The problem is, again, like the world is so different. The invasive plants that Garth mentioned, we have the same things here. The fact that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere makes, competition work differently. We haven't even talked about nitrogen. Nitrogen deposition is a huge thing in this part of the world, that really changes that balance too. So unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, we have to be looking at like what's the world like now? What's it going to be as it continues to change? And then how do we set management objectives based on that? And so what we do here is our big focus, the thing that we always have as our prime objective is ecological resilience. which is sort of the capacity for an ecosystem to adapt to whatever is thrown at it and maintain its, essential functions. And that's driven from our standpoint, there's two things that we focus on. We focus on the species diversity, that's plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, whatever you want. The more species you have, the more different players there are in the game. If one of them's having a bad game, others can come in off the bench and play that role. There's like that redundancy of function is super important. And then the second is the habitat size and connectivity. So in a fragmented landscape, one of the things that kills resilience really fast is, breaking it up into little tiny patches where populations of animals and plants are small and there it's easy to lose something. You don't have the connectivity for things to move around and find where they need to go. And so rebuilding that connectivity with restoration work or just preserving what we do have is super important. So in that context, that gives us our working orders, right? We need species diversity and we need habitat size and connectivity. And anything that works against those things, we push back against and try to solve. And anything that's good for that, we try to facilitate and foster. Um, so it's not that we're completely working blind, but it is really challenging to make sure that we're not looking backwards so much that we lose track of what's in front of us.
Yeah, well, I would jump in on top and say that, yes, that's what we're trying to do. I mean, obviously, our organization, we talk. So, yeah, we have a unified vision and share a lot about how we are trying to achieve that. But in some of the landscapes where I work, one way to simplify that too, both for our own stewards, but for how we communicate to our partners and work together. One way is we've started to think about it as a threat-based management approach. So yes to everything you said, and we'll set some goals and monitor, but when we're working in a collaborative setting, we'll talk about what are the threats to that ecological resilience. And then, one of the things that I don't think we're going to talk too much today about, though, with Nature Conservancy has a long history of working in community-centered partnerships where we develop a place-based program of work, and then we work with the neighbors, and then the neighbors' neighbors, and then the agencies that work across multiple sites and states. And we're continuing to do that, maybe a little less traditionally, not always at a nature preserve. Now it might be a different kind of center that we're focused on. And that has led to some of our Western states thinking about where are those big core areas of still fairly resilient and resistant landscape scale places, and taking I guess the shorthand is identify them, defend and grow the core. And that is, so you're focused in those places, so you're prioritizing work in an area that's still in pretty good shape. You don't necessarily stop working in other places, but you make sure you don't neglect those core areas. And then you connect them with restoration. And back to the threat-based management, is you think about what are the main threats that are eroding the resilience of those core areas, and it's weeds and fragmentation, conversion, inappropriate management, and then you start addressing those things with your conservation strategies, which can include restoration and weed treatments and other things like that. But it's a way to sort of translate what might feel kind of academic and conservation science way of describing it to, to somebody who's dealing with weeds, like we're addressing the threats. And the good news is those threats that threaten ecosystem resilience also often threaten other values that a community might hold, their livelihoods, for example, or their safety, fire risk reduction and forage. So.
Yeah, that's funny. That's exactly what I was going to jump in with, which is, here a lot of what we're trying to do is manage for things like pollinator communities. And what we find is that those objectives are typically very compatible with a rancher's objectives for, maintaining consistent forage for their cattle. They need a resilient ecosystem just like the pollinators do. Um, and so a lot of the challenges making sure we're having conversations that use the right language so that we're talking about the same things, even if we're coming at it for different reasons, we're aiming for the same thing a lot of the time. And so
Mhm.
the challenge is just making sure that we're explaining what we're trying to do and helping them see sort of the big picture from a different perspective sometimes.
Yeah, it's really fun to get schooled in ecosystem management by somebody who hasn't got a degree in it, but they've lived it. They know how to manage for it. It's really actually really rewarding when the light bulbs go off and you haven't lectured somebody about biodiversity. Instead, they show you how to manage the meadow, and you're like, oh yeah, you got it.
Yep. And they may not call things the same as we do, right? They'll have different names for plants, but they know what they are a lot of times. A lot of ranchers are very, very observant, and they see how things respond, not just to their cattle, but, to the climate and to anything that happens. And that wealth of experience, like you said, it's really fun to learn from people that have been out there for a long time.
That's awesome. And yeah, and you're interacting with people who have a love for the landscape in a different capacity, which is really interesting to learn from too, and or land that's been within a family for generations or what have you. So it's an really cool way to just get the co-benefits, of what we're all trying to accomplish ultimately. Um, so I think, well, I want to touch on this and I want to make sure there's enough time to touch on this because we did have a ton of questions about it. We're kind of talking, around it a little bit when we're talking about management practices with combining it with fire or and that's grazing. There was a lot of conversation or a lot of questions about grazing, generally speaking. So I wanted to give you both kind of an opportunity to talk about grazing, whether it's with cattle or bison or both, and maybe how you have used those in your restoration practices or in your management practices from each of your perspectives from different types of grasslands.
Garth, I keep going first. Do you want to hit this one first, or do you want me to? Okay. All right, I'll hit it first. Um, where to start? So I think the first thing you should know about grazing, at least in the context we're working here, one of the best things about grazing is that it is a really great way to manipulate the habitat structure that's out there on the landscape. So if you think about a grassland in terms of architecture, you can have a patch of grassland habitat that's really short. All the plants are short, there's a lot of bare ground in between the plants. That's a really valuable habitat for a lot of things, including some birds that like to nest there. A lot of bees, a lot of solitary bees like to have that bare soil to nest and make their nest burrows in. There's lots, I could go on and on. On the other end of the spectrum, you have sort of tall and dense vegetation, right? Things that might, in some places, are 6, 8 feet tall, other places 3 or 4 feet tall, but it's dense. There's a lot of vegetation there. It's very thick. And there's some animals that really like that habitat. It's really easy to hide in. They can burrow around in it and feel safe. But on the flip side of that, there's a lot of plants that don't do well when they're too crowded like that and that really need that open space, and then vice versa. And then there's all this stuff in between. And the nice thing about grazing is you're working with animals who are making bite by bite choices about what they're choosing to eat. It's incredibly flexible strategy because you can choose how many animals you want per unit area, when you want them there, how long you want them there. So you can manage the intensity of grazing, the duration of grazing, the frequency of grazing, the timing of grazing. Um, and it can be done badly for sure. And there's lots of examples of where it's degrading an ecosystem, but it also has tremendous potential to do really good things and to do things that we can't do with other tools. So, we can use mowing, we can use fire to change the height of vegetation, but creating a habitat where you have a mixture of heights and densities is really challenging without something like a grazing animal that's going to go in and eat some plants and not others, and we can influence which plants they want to eat by all those things that I just mentioned. Like there's a real science to that, but also you get surprised every time because they can make their own choices. So you have to be able to live with and sort of appreciate the chaos a little bit. Um, so that's sort of the big background. And so our goal a lot of times with our management in general here is to create a shifting mosaic of all those different habitat types: tall, dense, short, sparse, intermixed, medium. Um, and then make sure that those move around the landscape so that any big area of prairie, there's the habitat that any animal would need and can go find and live in. And that if you're a plant, you don't get the same growing conditions every year. There's something that's going to be different every year. And this year you might be sort of overshadowed and it might be a tough year. And then next year it's going to get grazed off and you'll have a lot of light hitting the ground and you can flourish if that's what you're looking for. And so you can sort of hunker down through some tough times and then thrive when you get the chance. And by doing that, by having that shifting mosaic of all those different habitat types, we think we can support that biodiversity that's so important for ecological resilience. So, and then the second thing I'll say is that there are a lot of questions about cattle versus bison. Um, they're both great. Uh, Cattle are important now because that's the dominant livestock, or that's the dominant grazer, large grazer that's on the landscape, which means if we're going to influence that private land that's so important for us to influence, we have to figure out how to use cattle grazing in very positive ways to do what we need to do with that. At the same time, we have a bunch of bison herds within the Nature Conservancy. Bison is a species that's a conservation target for us. We're trying to, boost the number of those native grazers across the country. Um, and so we're doing both from a pure management standpoint. If the only goal is to manage that habitat we talked about, we can use either animal very effectively. There are a few differences between them, but they're mostly behavioral. Um, Bison are maybe a little bit more selective toward grasses. They eat a fewer broadleaf plants, but they will eat a lot of broadleaf plants, and so do cattle. Um, but like bison don't like to sit around in water or sit around in the shade as much as cattle do. Um, Cattle like to do that. And so you have to sort of recognize those behavioral patterns and then manage in a way that you either take advantage of them or you minimize any potential risks with them. But apart from that, really just again, from pure management standpoint, both cattle and bison can be really good in terms of reaching our objectives. All right, Garth.
Yeah, so I'd say what you said, with some changes. I mentioned before the private land, public land nexus. And maybe I'd tell a little story about a project that I'm working on right now with a land trust. So the Nature Conservancy helped the Oregon Desert Land Trust, which is a fairly new organization, acquire a private ranch. It was it's about 17,000 acres. And it's essentially a set of meadows in a valley, and then there's two mountain ranges on either side of that valley, and the other private parcels are up in the hills and are the springs and streams in the mountains. And that's a legacy of how the Homesteading Act and other land claims that were made down in that part of southeast Oregon. And that 17,000 acres they're associated with grazing permits on public land allotments that cover 500,000 acres. So 500,000 acres is where they graze the cattle. And so historically that ranch would winter their cows down in the meadows and then move up into the hills all summer long or in spring and have season-long grazing. So what you said about using cattle as a tool is absolutely what we're trying to do now with the land trust. But we have a challenge where some of our pastures are 50,000 acres and there's no internal fences. So we can't do that patch grazing that you're describing unless we have range riders that are moving the cows. They're basically living with the cattle and moving them around, which is one option, which historically is kind of what happened. But 50, 60 years ago, that stopped happening, and now people just turn the cattle out. So where I was going with that is in order to kind of turn the cattle back into management tools, we're exploring using virtual fence. And I know you've been talking about doing that in Nebraska. There's a lot of ranches that are exploring that. And it's essentially the technology is really similar to the invisible fence that people use for their pets. So there's a collar on the animal that has, in this case, it's a GPS collar that talks to satellites and also talks through Wi-Fi towers and cells. So there's a lot of ways to communicate with these collars. And then there's a virtual fence boundary that's drawn, and that collar has both audio cues and electric shock cue. And I have taken one for the herd. I know what it feels like. If you've ever touched an electric fence, that's what it feels like. It's surprising more than painful. So you don't want to do it again, but it's not like you're punishing the cow. Anyway, so where I'm going with that, Chris, is now we can do some of that patch grazing. we can draw a line on the computer or in an app, and we can move 300 cows into that part of the pasture where we have a weed problem, for example, and we want to do a weed treatment later. We go and we, you know, direct the herd to have a higher impact of grazing on those weeds, or we avoid a riparian zone or a spring. And we're still in the learning phase. And one of the challenges we have is that you need to put towers up in order to communicate with the callers. And so that'll be an ongoing partnership with the Bureau of Land Management, which really wants to advance the technology, but they have rules and regulations about putting up towers on public land, for example. So we're experimenting with these pilot projects to figure out how we can cover a large ranch of 500,000 acres with the technology. And, you know, it's going so fast, Chris. It'll all probably be satellite in the next few years anyway. But what we're doing in the meantime is learning from those, you know, experiments of how to get certain outcomes with grazing, and now trying to apply it in these landscapes.
Yeah, I love that. We were hoping to start it this year. We're going to be doing it next year. It's got so much potential to do good work from a conservation standpoint. I would just say, you know, I think a lot of people see the negatives of cattle grazing, and there are a lot of them. Like, again, there's a lot of cattle grazing out there that's done in a way that is degrading the ecosystem. But that usually is because of one of two things. It's either because there are just too many animals. You know, stocking rate matters and is king of everything in terms of grazing impacts. If you have too many cows or too many bison, it can be the same thing. It's going to be a problem. You can't have too many for what the land can support. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is like doing the same thing in the same place over and over um, is usually going to be bad. And it's what I said earlier about winners and losers. You know, if you have the cattle in the same place at the same time of year over and over, they're going to graze the same species of plants, and those are never going to get a chance to succeed. They're going to start to lose energy, and eventually you'll lose those species potentially from that place. And the species that the cattle aren't grazing, either because they don't like them as much or because they grow at a different time than when the cows are there, they start to win. And then you end up with fewer overall plants, and you have a weird competitive balance, and you lose diversity, which again is the objective that we're aiming for resilience. And so if you can manage the stocking rate and work with people to, you know, get the right number of animals out there and then focus on moving them around so they're not having the same impacts in the same places. That's a lot of what we do. And then what you said layers on top of that, right? Like how do we then strategically put them in places where we need them for a specific role, right? We want to knock this invasive plant back right now. We want to stay out of this area during the time that this plant blooms or that this animal is there. Um, one of the big challenges right now in the Great Plains is we've been learning about milkweed and grazing. It turns out the cattle and bison both really like to eat a lot of the milkweed species that are important for monarchs. And so it's interesting that like in a way that's a negative and in a way it's a positive because for a long time ranchers have seen milkweeds as a weed that their cows aren't going to eat because they have the toxic latex, that white sticky stuff in it. And so there are people who have been fighting against milkweeds in their pastures. And so on the positive side, we're out there talking to ranchers like, no, this is one of the favorite plants for your animals. Like you should celebrate if you have milkweeds. It's a really good thing. But at the same time, those cows are eating the milkweeds before the monarchs can get them sometimes. And so we're trying to figure out like what are those grazing strategies where we can support the nectar abundance and the abundance of those plants that the monarchs need for food as adults, but also preserve, you know, big patches of milkweed for the larvae. And I don't have answers to that, but it's one of the things that we're really focusing on right now.
I was gonna pile on, but it looked like, Alyssa, you're gonna ask another question. You want me to go one more?
I want to go ahead. I'll let you add on, but I also just wanted to like chime in. I do have another question, obviously, because I have a list of them. But I just wanted to chime in and say, you know, like I think sometimes there's a question of like, well, what are we talking about this for? This, you know, with monarchs, and this is again just the interconnectedness of all of these things and talking to people and talking about their land and how the land is used and finding those ways to have those conversations. But no, Garth, go ahead.
I was just going to make a quick plug for adaptive management and using an evidence-based approach. And that's something that the Nature Conservancy has strived for. I know as somebody who's tried to practice it, it's really hard. But keeping track of what you've done and see what your results are so that you can learn from that is really important. And there's a lot of people that I know in the private sector and even back in the Midwest where I still have family, like they keep phenology logs. I mean, they know what they've done in their gardens for their pollinator gardens and stuff. And it's the same story for natural resource management at larger scale. Like you start to learn what works and what didn't work, and sharing what didn't work is probably more important than sharing what worked. You really learn from your mistakes. And I was just going to say, in the grazing world, we've really had a hard time documenting like what kind of grazing treatment happened in that pasture. You know, you had cows in there. You might even know the window of time, but you don't know where they spent all their time. And so one of the things that I like about the emerging technology with collars or ear tags is now that data is starting to be available. You can see a heat map of where the cows were in the pasture now, if they all have a collar or an ear tag that's talking to it, that's transmitting to a tower. And I think that's heading in the right direction. And it's one of the things the Nature Conservancy is exploring, I guess globally, but more organized in North America, is around traceability. Is where does your meat come from? Does it come from a herd that's been managed well, that has some biodiversity benefit? And so, I mean, at some point, I guess we might talk about it or may not, like, well, what can people do, to help support this work? And that's one of the things, is start to, and it's hard as a consumer to know where your food comes from. But as it starts to become possible, let's all support that. Let's double down on it. Let's ask for it, to say, like, I'm going to eat beef. I want to eat beef that comes from a place that's taking care of the land, and paying attention to the pollinators. And so if we as consumers are leaning into that, then the producers will be like, well, great. They like that, but if they don't get paid for it, they're probably not going to do it. So a bit of a tangent, but I thought I'd just.
Well, but it is really important, and everybody should choose uh what they eat based on their own preferences. But and there's nothing wrong with being a vegetarian or vegan, and there's a lot of good reasons to do that. But at the same time, the market for beef in a lot of ways supports the health and diversity of the grasslands that I work with, right? If if ranchers went out of business because nobody wanted to eat cows anymore, um, it's not as simple as, well, let's just put bison back on the landscape, because the same problem would happen. You quickly get too many bison out the landscape. We're gonna have to do something with them. Um, and right now there is not enough of a market for bison to do that. It doesn't make sense to just do sort of this wholesale change. And so you think about like the greenhouse gases associated with these big grazing animals, and you say, well, that's a bad thing. It is, but also in context, like the bison that were here 500 years ago were putting out all those greenhouse gases, and now we've just replaced those with cows that are putting out greenhouse gases. So it's not a simple thing, right? So again, I'm not saying I have the answers or telling anybody what to do. It's just really complex. And the grasslands in the Midwest and Great Plains are adapted to grazing. They've been adapted to grazing forever. That habitat structure created by grazing animals is crucial for the survival of a huge percentage of the diversity of species that we have out here. So, yeah, it's a complicated world. Good luck figuring it out.
Well, it's a complicated world, and learning, taking the steps to learn or what have you about choices and things that can potentially make a difference, or at least give you a better understanding of ecosystem functionalities, of how our choices affect that, is a great step. So all of these questions that you all have submitted, it's just a step in the learning process, and we're all on that same kind of path and journey, which is pretty awesome. But Garth, I did want to, because there was a great question about kind of emerging tools and technologies as it relates to kind of the conservation field and what you all are doing. I just wanted to see if you had anything to expand on. They had specifically mentioned like eDNA or remote sensing. I know you're mentioning, the collars and the heat maps. Where is more technology needed, or is there any more tech that is kind of coming out that's been really helpful?
Um, Well, I'm not sure where to take this, except that yes, I think technology is really important. And I also don't want to get lost in it to say like, oh, that's our answer. Like we can tech our way out of this climate and biodiversity twin crises. Like we won't, but they're going to be good tools that'll help us. The virtual fence is a really good example of a tool that if you don't have other information, you wouldn't know the best way to use that tool. You might be able to get the best weight gain on your cows by moving them around, optimizing your forage, but you wouldn't know your biodiversity impact or your landscape scale, habitat composition and structure impacts. And that's where remote sensing pairs really nicely with some of these other technologies. And they're in rangelands and grasslands. I think it's less appropriate for prairies at this point, but I think it's getting better. There's something called the Rangeland, oh, is it the assessment platform? Do you know the RAP, Chris?
Rangeland analysis platform.
Analysis platform. And it's a really amazing tool, and it uses Landsat imagery that can now go back, I think, 30 years. And so the post-processing of that data is now allowing us to look at things like tree encroachment into grassland systems, the percent of brush to grass ratios. And so you don't necessarily get species ID, but you can see composition and structure trends and condition. And then you can pair that with some management or things like fire history, and you can learn a lot about what's happening at a landscape scale using that tool. And now if we can pair that with some other technologies like photo interpretation via drones and artificial intelligence, which can now spot weed infestations, with drone imagery. Like there's some really powerful stuff that can happen. I think it tends to make more sense when you scale up and you're working on larger landscapes, because you don't necessarily need to do that on a 40-acre, plot of land. You can use your eyeballs and some photo monitoring and other ways to collect data. But anyway, I do think some of that is really impactful. One last thing I'd throw out there that the Nature Conservancy has invested some in, but we mostly rely on partners, and that's wildlife migration information, looking at, particularly in the West, large ungulates that need to move across really large landscapes. So the connectivity that Chris mentioned, where that connectivity is really matters for things like pronghorn, for example. But I should have had it at my fingertips. Maybe somebody can Google it and drop it in the chat. But there was a really cool article I just saw about radio tagging monarchs and seeing where what their migration routes are. So the technology that got down small enough to put on a butterfly, and now we see that I think there was like a monarch from New Jersey went to Cuba or something like that. I mean, like, wow. That is amazing that we now have that kind of information, and we just need to be ready to absorb that and figure out what to do with it in a conservation context.
That's awesome. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that just came out. MJV actually just posted a social media article on it, but a lot of cool tech that's out there that we're using remote sensing to look at milkweed stems on properties and landscapes. There's just so much out there, and it's constantly changing. So a lot of good tools probably on the horizon that we don't even know about at this point, which is really cool. I did want to just quickly address, because I think there was a good question in the Q&A, and I do have a couple more questions I want to make sure that we hit, but I thought it was good to maybe address this one now, as far as kind of if a site is truly untouched or like a remnant prairie or something of that nature, shouldn't we just kind of allow nature to take its course? If it's kind of in that vein or in that space, can it just kind of do its own thing and manage itself and go that route? So Chris, I see you
Yeah,
unmuted there.
this is a question we get all the time, in some form, right? And it's a really good question. I think I'll take you back to what I said earlier about the humans and interactions with grasslands, and I'll expand a little bit on that. So, starting with the grasslands in the central part of the US, as long as those current grasslands have existed, they've been managed by people. And they've had this very strong tie with humans and those objectives we talked about earlier. And so they've never not been managed by people. So, I mean, because before that, before prairies were there. It was ice. Before that, it was an ocean at one point. I mean, it's the current day grasslands have that tie. And so you really can't separate people in grasslands. We can make the decision to do nothing, but that's not necessarily a good thing. And what we know what happens when we sort of back off of these areas, even the areas that are in good shape. If we back away from them and don't do anything, they get invaded by non-native grasses, and they lose diversity because they become simplified in the plant community. Woody plants move in and change them from a grassland into a shrubland or a woodland. And again, you could argue about whether that's good or natural or whatever, but it's definitely not good for biodiversity, at least in the short run, right? If you did an experiment, you just removed all the humans from the earth, it would be like you would have a big extinction event. You would have this huge chaos that would be bad for biodiversity for a while, and then things would settle into a new pattern. But like, I don't think that's what we want to do right now. And then just outside of the Great Plains and Midwest, there's been some really cool research around the globe about, I think something like 3/4 of all the ecosystems on Earth have that strong tie with humans and interactions for the last 30,000 years, which is plenty of time for evolution and natural selection. And so I think the point is that there are very few places where we can just sort of back off and expect things to go well. Um, and so it's more of a decision, not do we get involved, but how do we get involved? And we have this responsibility to continue the management that's been going on in these landscapes for, thousands, tens of thousands of years. Um, we have to recognize the people who have been doing it for a long time and then sort of take the responsibility on our shoulders to do it well going forward. At least that's my perspective. I don't know, Garth, if you see that any differently.
No, I'd say it's a bit of a mic drop. I agree.
Chris summed it up perfectly. We can all go home. We're heading out. So that's it. There's no questions left, and the puzzle is solved. No, I think that's a really great question, and I do want to recognize that we're kind of at the top of the hour. So if you all do have questions, just a reminder to put them in the Q&A. I see there's a handful in there, but there's 2 questions in this list that I do want to make sure that we get to. So I'm going to throw 2 more out there. And I think this is a good kind of question in terms of planting kind of techniques. So how do planting techniques differ in like a small scale setting, like an individual in their backyard versus a large scale acreage grassland restoration project? What's the differences? Garth, I'm going to make you go first. Oh, Chris unmuted though.
Oh. Okay. Well, it's a really good question, and I think always good questions. Always the answers start with "it depends." So in my case, it depends, like how extreme those scales are, because I think if you're doing, say, you want to enrich your small property with more plants that are good for pollinators or wildlife. There's often great resources from local nurseries, and you can research native seed availability in your area or buy plugs, and it's feasible for you to basically garden even at a pretty large scale with those resources. But when you start moving into restoration at a larger scale, there's not often enough of those resources available, or it becomes cost prohibitive. Like you're just not going to be able to afford to do acres and acres with that resource. So then you start to think a little bit more about what are you trying to achieve. So you may have a simpler mix, for example, and then you have to see what your resources are. And again, for something that might be in the tens of acres, you might have some resources you could use. But I know in large parts of the country, there just aren't sort of locally adapted, local ecotype appropriate native seeds or plants available to do things at a really large scale. So it starts to get harder and obviously more expensive as you get larger. But I think maybe I'm drifting from the intent of your question, but I think it really comes down to what are you trying to do? Like, what does success look like? And if you're trying to create some buffer habitat to a higher quality area or something, you need to think about what are you buffering it from? So if you're trying to buffer from weeds or something, then you think about, okay, you want something that holds the site, as one phrase is like what fills in that space and takes up those niches that will help buffer it from weeds. And you might use cultivars or other, that's the term in the native seed world is workhorse species. So things that are available at a pretty large scale that you could buy a lot of. And then you would probably use something like a rangeland seed drill rather than hand seeding. And so that the technologies start to shift as you go up in scale. But maybe that's enough for me. Chris, what are your thoughts?
Oh, I think that's great. I think one of the nice things about working in a small area, whether it's a backyard or even, like potted plants on an apartment balcony, I mean, you have the ability to have a lot of control and make it exactly what you want. Um, like you said, when we're working with hundreds or thousands of acres at a time, like it's really tricky. You have to focus on big picture things and you have to let go of a lot of the little micro decisions that we can make in our own yards or in those small spaces. So that it can be really fun and you can learn a ton from doing work at that small scale just by watching what happens and then making decisions about what you want to change and the adaptive management that you mentioned earlier, Garth. I mean, it's such a cool process to watch. And then the other thing I'll mention is, I mean, it's Garth and I are talking about doing our work on these big areas and having tried to, have a real impact on the world. But you can have a real impact on the world in your small spots too. Um, and monarchs and pollinators are a really easy example of that, just by putting a lot of plant diversity and flower diversity in your yard or again on your apartment balcony, you're providing a tangible benefit to those species that are going to use those plants. And not just pollinators, by the way. I mean, anything that eats the plants that you've provided is a win, right? And I think sometimes we lose track of that. There's this like beneficial insects versus pest insects, and sometimes like something if something is eating my sunflower, that becomes a pest. It's like, no, no, no. If you put the sunflower there for habitat and something's eating it, you won. That's exactly what we wanted. Um, but so you can have those really cool benefits. And the other piece I think that doesn't get enough attention on those like native plant gardens and things is that you're having a huge social impact by normalizing native plants, helping people to see what they look like. And then when people go out to a grassland, because let's face it, grasslands are not appreciated by everyone in the way that we appreciate them. A lot of them see them sort of boring areas with nothing there that's all that interesting. But if people get used to seeing native plants in their neighborhood and as they walk their dogs or just walk around, when they go out to a prairie and they see those same native plants, now they're going to be familiar, they're going to be interested in it. So that normalization of these native plants is a really, really important piece of adding them to our landscaping. And the last thing I'll say is like that doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing, right? I talk about this all the time. In our yard, we have zinnias, we have daffodils, we have things like that we just either A, make us happy because they're really pretty, or B, also like zinnias provide a ton of benefits for pollinators, and we have our native plants. And so like you don't have to go 100%, convert my whole yard to be native to do a lot of really good things. If you have a yard, you're really lucky. You should make it into something that makes you happy and don't worry about, trying to be a purist about it. Unless that makes you happy, and then you should.
Well, I think that I'm going to just ask this question and then because I want to highlight that this was asked and inquired about, and hopefully you're on this call. Does my small 2.5 acre restoration have much positive impact when everything else around it is mowed?
Yes. In fact, it provides more, right? If you're the only island in the ocean, uh, providing habitat for some of those species, that's incredibly important. So yeah, do everything you can with the space you have and feel good about it.
Yeah, I just really wanted to highlight that question also. Garth, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just, yeah, uh, +1 to that. Yeah, definitely. And I guess my personal story on that is growing up in the Chicago area. There's something called the Chicago Wilderness Initiative or program. I don't remember what it's officially called now, but 20 years ago it was called Chicago Wilderness. And it was an attempt to document all of the little remnant prairie bits and savannas. And I just loved going around to all those little spots. Sometimes they were like a railroad right away or back of a cemetery, or a lot of the park district there, which was picnic tables and, ball fields, but had prairie and oak savanna remnants. They were often only an acre in size, but they absolutely kept the biodiversity in that area, and it is tremendous. And now that they're being managed, oh, it's just really cool to see, that really does make a difference. Those little stepping stones do add up.
And they may not be big enough to host prairie chickens or bison or some of those big roaming species, but it's really incredible to see how much can live in a tiny little space like that. It's really inspiring actually if you start to pay attention to it.
Yeah, so that was a really great question. I think I just wanted to make sure that I'm hoping that person is on the call. If not, I hope they watch the recording, because your property does make a difference and what you're doing to it does make a difference. So, thank you guys for sharing your thoughts on that. I do want to hit some of the questions that came in via the Q&A, and I think this one is kind of helpful as we're talking about like kind of your landscape when you're thinking about like kind of a personal level or a smaller level. And the question was said, there are many areas in the country where grazing isn't a viable option, or they're not in the system, or there's small fragmented fields in the landscape. So what types of things can emulate that? Is it just mowing or haying, or what kind of actions would you take then?
I mean, I have an answer. Garth, you have an answer you want to hit first?
Go for it.
All right. I mean, mowing is definitely a good thing. If you've got access to a mower and you have the ability to do that, you can do a lot with a mower. I mean, I talked earlier about how cool grazing is because of that selective, bites and really easy to manipulate a mixed stand of different heights and architectures. But I think we sometimes forget that with a mower, you have a lot of options too, right? You don't have to just set it on the ground and mow a big patch. You can mow areas at different heights. So you can, you know, if you have an acre, you could mow some of it high, some of it low, skip some of it, mow some of it, make little curly Q patterns of trails and things. There's a lot you can do if you're willing to be creative. And then again, just change it up year to year, right? If you mow one area really short this year, let that grow tall next year, mow a different area really short. Um, and then in addition to that, things like, I mean, fire for sure. If you have access to fire, usually fire is even more challenging than mowing, but you can do things with fire where you can vary the season of fire. If you have a small isolated place, you don't want to burn the whole thing because anything that is at a vulnerable stage of life, you could wipe out an entire population. So if you have an acre of prairie and you can burn a little bit of it, every year and burn it differently, but early spring, late spring, summer, fall, winter burns, all those different things are ways that you can vary that. Um, and then, again, like in the context of a yard, even, a little pile of sticks over in the corner for some habitat, create an area where there's some bare soil for access for nesting bees and tiger beetles and things that like that bare ground, or just a space for things to come out and sit in the sun for a while. Just thinking about those little micro habitats that you can add into the landscape. Um, it's really fun to create something and then see what uses it and then learn from that and then try something different and adapt it over time. So there's a lot of ways if you're creative and thoughtful about things to do really good things on a small scale.
Yeah, again, I don't have much to add to that, except that I do think you can do those multiple benefit analysis too. So say you do have some encroaching brush, like maybe you mow that a little heavier for a few years in a row and then give it a rest. Just things like that, which I think people sort of naturally start to figure out once they get into the management game.
That's awesome. I think that also goes back to like keeping track of like what is happening on your property too, like how you're doing those management practices, even if it's small, and then you can kind of make those notes of those things. So, it's all about essentially collecting the data on your end and seeing what works and doesn't work, much like Garth and Chris in a big scale. Um, so I have a couple more questions. And this one is its relationship to milkweed and fire. What are the positives and negatives on the fire effects on milkweed plants in sagebrush steppe and or grassland habitats?
They said sagebrush, Garth, so why don't you start?
Well, I'd say it's a lot less of an issue in sagebrush. There's fewer species, for example. And so I would say it's back to the seasonality, like it depends when you're burning. So if you're trying to, and I would say there's very few places where you do smaller scale sagebrush steppe prescribed fire. They tend to be larger. So we would be less likely to be targeting individual species. And I would say probably what we would do is exclude that area from our burn. Like that's our, because we're working at a larger scale. So we wouldn't be micro targeting, that. And over in the Willamette Valley, which if you're not familiar with the West Coast, there's a range, a mountain range along the coast, and then a valley. That's where a lot of the people live. That's really fertile farmlands. And then another mountain range, the Cascade Range. In that valley, that's where you have more of the monarchs um, and the milkweeds that they depend on than in the sagebrush steppe. So there it is a little bit more like in the Midwest, where you try to understand what you've got going on and you time your burns to not have a negative impact on the milkweeds. So I'd say in general, it's a timing thing. So if you burn them when the milkweeds are coming up, you're going to knock them back. But most of ours, I think all of ours are pretty vigorous perennials. And so they're going to come back. If you don't hit them again next year, they're going to be okay.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing for us. We have 17 milkweeds in Nebraska. They're all perennials. Um, and so if we're managing for that shifting mosaic we talked about, where you're doing something different in different places, there will be parts of that prairie that have really strong milkweed populations one year, and other areas where maybe the milkweed's not doing as well, and then the next year it'll be different. So you always have enough milkweed out there. It's just going to be in slightly different places. Um, it's why you don't burn the whole thing at the same time and do it at the same time every year or in the same place.
So again, you're connecting all of these different species usage of these different habitats and timing all of those things together with all of those practices.
Yeah.
Anyways,
And it's not just about milkweeds for monarchs, obviously, right? We need to have big patches of the flowers that the adults are feeding on. And sometimes managing for milkweed and managing for a diversity of flowers is going to need something different in terms of a technique. And so that's why that mosaic of patches is really important.
good question. All right, I really like this question. I'm going to ask it for you guys. What's your best across the aisle pitch to invest in grassland conservation without assuming that one cares about wildlife?
I think about this all the time, and not necessarily from a political standpoint, but just, again, how do we get people interested in grasslands when most people see them as sort of something you have to drive through to get to something interesting, right? Um, you're trying to get to the Cascades. I got to get through all this boring grassy stuff so I can get to the mountains. Um, and as a photographer, my strategy is I want to make grasslands fascinating, right? I don't lead with things like climate change or carbon sequestration or clean water, things like that. I lead with like, let me tell you about the amazing species that live in grasslands and why they're so fun to learn about and why you should go look for them. And then if people get excited about that, then it becomes personal and they see prairies as the place where these really cool species live. And then they start to mean something, right? And then you care about them and then you can learn about, how they provide food for us or, clean water or carbon, all those other things are down the road for me. Um, and I would say I would do the same thing with politicians, right? I mean, if a politician is interested in prairies because they have a personal connection to it, they've been out there and they've seen things that are interesting, they're going to see it differently, and that'll affect the way that they do their calculations about value as well. But especially as scientists, I think we jump to value and we jump to data and facts and things too quickly sometimes, and we forget that like storytelling is how we communicate with people as humans. Um, and so, starting with why they're interesting and cool is I think a better strategy.
Well, I don't think you're wrong, Chris. I think having that human touch like that, that'll get people interested, and then maybe there is a conversation around the ecosystem services, you know. But I would agree. And one of the things I've had fun with over the past few years is iNaturalist. Like there's been when I was an undergrad, I really wanted to be a natural historian. Like that's what I wanted. And they just like, and the professors just laughed. They said, that doesn't, you're a century late, man. That there isn't a, you know, natural history is over. But it's not, and it's coming back. I think there's a real surge of people interested, and it's not just those of us that are, you know, maybe too old fashioned or sunsetting. Like there's a lot of young people that are way into it. And I think it's a collector vibe or something, but it's a great way to engage people and particularly younger people about like, what am I seeing, you know, without going through a big book, a tome of like, you know, there's 10 things that look like this. But iNaturalist says if it's been seen there before, and I don't know, it's just another way to maybe it's technology, people love their phones, but it's just another way that you don't have to get really wonky to talk about, you know, tons of carbon sequestered, and because people don't really, that doesn't mean anything to them. But,
And I think you're right. That's so cool that, it's like a game, right? It's like a scavenger hunt. You can go out and see what you can find today, figure out what it is, but also, and this is, I mean, I think that that younger generation, they want to help. They're, I mean, everybody wants to help, but I think there's a special, like my kids' age, like that's such a huge piece for them. Like, what can I do for the world? And so the idea that you could play a game or like go out and do hide and seek and scavenger hunt and find these cool things, but also record data that's actually helpful, that's gonna, help with conservation efforts. That's an amazing mixture of things and a great use of that technology.
That's awesome. That's a great answer. I love the storytelling piece to the puzzle. I feel like sometimes that can be challenging to remind people of that there's a whole story behind everything. I did, just for reference, drop Chris's blog in the chat because he was, one, telling great stories on his blog. Two, he is a fantastic photographer. So you can check out some of his photographs in there and connect yourselves through that as well. So I wanted to make sure that we share that, and we'll share it in the follow-up email as well. We did get a question that just came in, and I wanted to ask this also. Could you say a few words about grassland management to assist declining grassland bird populations in both in both of your regions?
Go ahead, Garth.
there's a race. Who's going to come off mute first? Well, it's a great question, and it's a really tough one because there's a lot going on there. You know, obviously, there you can do everything right on your piece of ground, and if it's a migratory bird, you know, there's a lot of other things going on with it. But that said, I do think there are some things like I know what I've been working on. There's seem relatively small, but if you're working with farmers and ranchers, I mean, that's what I do. You start by finding out the common ground, things you care about, and you do find out they do care about wildlife and birds usually too, and you explore what's going on. And typically you'll find that if they're, say, haying or grazing, the timing of those activities are having a lot of impact on those birds. So if you can work with them to extend the first cut of their hay back, it's often just a couple of weeks, but that can have a huge difference in the impact on those grassland nesting birds. So like some birds only do a single clutch, some might do two or even three, depending on what happens. But if you can get that first clutch through before it's hayed, like that's huge. Otherwise, it's just a sink. They keep trying and they keep losing their nest. So if you can extend the haying period, you know, until it depends on where you are, but into say mid-July or something, that you know that's typically really helpful. Yeah, I don't know. I could go on a little bit more, but let's see if what Chris was going to mention.
I mean, the other thing I would say is that grassland birds are really tied to that habitat structure we keep talking about. So just providing a mixture of those habitat structure types. And the other thing that they care about is size, right? They don't, most grassland bird species don't like to nest in small areas, and a lot of them don't like to nest near the edges of those grasslands where there's trees or roads or some kind of disturbance. And so it's a lot of it is like habitat protection, restoration work, anything we could do to make large areas where there's an interior area where they feel comfortable, and within that area, providing that variety of a different habitat structure so they find the nesting habitat that they need. And then it gets into what Garth was talking about in terms of let's make sure that they have that window of time to, raise their kids and get them to the point where they're ready to migrate, or if they're not migratory, just get them to adulthood. Um, in some ways, though, birds are pretty simple. Pollinators, you have to worry about like a diversity of flowers so they can regulate their diet and all that. Grassland birds are not really food limited most of the time. Like a lot of them do very well in an alfalfa field, if the habitat structure is right, or in a wheat field, it's there's plenty of food there for them. They're just looking for the structure that they need to nest in. I'm not saying we should put alfalfa and wheat out there for birds, but like if they can live there, they can live in our grasslands too. There's a lot more complex issues we normally have to deal with, and birds sort of come along for the ride as long as we have that size and we're managing for a mixture of habitat structure.
Yeah, and maybe I'd throw out one thing, and I don't know who's all on the webinar today, but if you live in an area that has conservation reserve program lands or other farm bill, uh, programs to, yeah, it's basically CRP, but there's wetland reserve, there's some other programs out there. If, anyway, just leaning into that, letting your elected officials know that that's meaningful to you. The CRP probably has done more for grassland nesting birds than most other conservation programs in the U.S. And essentially, it's just replanting the low productivity ag lands back into perennial vegetation. Often not even, oh, sorry, yeah, acronyms. But that is another example of buffering higher quality habitat in a way that helps basically create the minimum area, like those area sensitive birds will now recognize that larger grassland as a place where they can breed.
That was a great question. I'm recognizing the time, so I want to kind of wrap with a final question, give or take. What's one thing that you would, if somebody is looking to help support grassland conservation, what's one thing that you would tell someone as an individual to do to help support grassland conservation?
Me first? Okay. Um, I mean, I'm going to go back to storytelling. I think really the most important thing you can do is to help people care. And if you like grasslands, talk to people about why you like grasslands. Tell your story. People connect with each other by like learning about what's exciting or interesting, or what the passion is of that other person. And if it's something that you're interested in and you can talk in a way that shows why you're passionate about it, that will rub off on other people. They'll respond to that. They'll ask you questions, and that passes on. Um, that grows the constituency for grasslands, right? And in the work that Garth and I are doing as professionals in this field, like none of that makes any difference if the public's not behind us. And so that would be the one thing that I need more than anything in terms of conservation support from the public is just care. Just be with us on this so that what we do, what we spend our whole careers on is going to matter, after we're gone.
Oh, that's great, Chris. I would agree. And then I might add my own bit to that is like I really I believe in local efforts for sure. The I mentioned before, community-centered partnerships, local efforts that all like multi-local and global is important. So I would put a pitch into find who's nearby, what conservation organization, grassland group is near you. Never pass up a chance to say, throw us, a donation or become a member of the Nature Conservancy. That would be great. But I think your impact will be much greater if you lean in locally to your local organizations, and then, grow it from there. So what Chris said, absolutely. And then if there's a place you can volunteer or support that's in your backyard, that's Yeah, that would be great.
That's great. Thank you guys. I quickly want to thank everybody for joining the call today. I know we, are getting late into some areas, or you're just getting into dinner and others, depending on where you are. I bet Garth is hungry. But, I want to thank you all for taking your time today to join us. I especially want to thank Chris and Garth for sharing their wealth of knowledge. I know I've learned a ton today just listening to you guys. So I really want to thank you for sharing that with us. Um, remember, Garth works out in Oregon and Chris works in Nebraska. If you're interested, look up the TNC area, look up your local TNC office. Monarch Joint Venture has tons of partners across the US too. If you're looking to get involved somewhere locally, connect on the MJV website with one of our partners locally, connect with a TNC office to find those opportunities. There's so much that you can do, and joining us today to learn more and learn about the stories that Chris and Garth are sharing and the work that they're doing really makes an impact not only for grassland conservation, but biodiversity as a whole, and of course, monarch conservation. So once again, thank you both for sharing your information. Thank you all for being engaging and having questions to ask and learn and being curious. And other than that, until our next Ask an Expert, you can join us for our last Monarch Conservation webinar on December 16th. I think Jenna's going to throw that she did, just threw it right in the chat on cue there. And yeah, with that, have a good evening for the rest of you all. Thank you again to Chris and Garth.
Thanks for having us.
That was a blast. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.